Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. We're pleased to begin this event discussing a grand strategy of democratic solidarity. My name is Abe Denmark. I'm the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We're pleased to welcome three distinguished guests today, Dr. Hal Brands, Dr. Charles Adel, Dr. Cory Shockey, to discuss Hal and Charlie's new article on a grand strategy of democratic solidarity. I'll offer some brief introductions and turn things over to Hal and Charlie for a description of their article and their arguments, followed by some remarks by Cory Shockey before we head to Q&A. For those of you in the audience, you can send questions to all three of the participants. You can do so over Twitter by tweeting at Asia Program, or you can email asia@wilsoncenter.org. So to start off, we'll have comments. We have Dr. Hal Brands, who's the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, also working as a senior fellow at AEI and a Bloomberg opinion columnist. And we have Dr. Charlie Adel, a senior fellow at the U.S. Study Center at the University of Sydney and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. And as a discussant, Cory Shockey is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI. I'll note that both Hal and Charlie are calling from separate cabins on vacation, so Wi-Fi may be a little spotty for them, but so far connections have been good. And so I'll turn things over now to Hal for the beginning of their presentation. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Abe. I really appreciate you hosting this event, and it's a lot of fun to be here, at least virtually, with Charlie and Cory, who have been good friends for a long time. So I'm gonna try to spare everyone the insult of simply reading to them word for word the article that everybody can download for themselves. So I think I'm gonna try to set the stage a little bit by talking a little bit about the logic of the piece and some of the key ideas, and then Charlie will walk us through some of the specifics, and we can go deeper on whatever pieces people want to go deeper on during the question and answer session. And so we'll try to keep this, I think, relatively brief to leave for plenty of time for Cory's comments and then the discussion. And so I think the basic idea of this piece, to mix my metaphors a little bit, was to kind of get serious about an idea that had been in the air but hadn't really been brought down to earth. And so the idea, obviously, is a grand strategy of democratic solidarity. And I think it had been relatively common since probably 2017 or 2018 to talk about the idea that one of the foremost things that the United States would need to do in order to meet rising challenges from China and other autocratic actors was to deepen cooperation with its democratic friends and friends of ours like Tom Wright and Kelly Magsamen and Cory, among others, have been doing great work on this and writing about it in a variety of forums. From a policy perspective, it was a little bit hard, in part because of just the unending churn caused by the Trump administration, and in part because the Trump administration blended calls for democratic solidarity vis-a-vis China with blatantly anti-democratic behavior at home and abroad, that it was a little bit difficult to spell out the logic of what a strategy, why the strategy was required and what it would entail. And I think we now have a little bit of a better opportunity to do so. So just in the first couple of months, we've seen the Biden administration signaling that cooperation with democratic countries is going to be at the forefront of its statecraft. The Quad summit a couple of weeks ago was certainly a move in that direction. And so what Charlie and I set out to do, really sort of in late December and January, when we wrote this, was to flesh out the concept of a strategy and to deal with some of the associated challenges. And we think that, just to kind of get the bottom line up front, the time for this is right, because democracies are increasingly threatened by illiberal influences within their borders, and also by autocratic regimes, principally China and Russia, that are increasingly ambitious in their efforts to reshape world orders. And so the overarching strategic question of the coming decades, I think, is going to be whether America and other democracies can preserve an international system that is predicated on the dominance of liberal governments and liberal ideas, or whether the world is going to slip back toward a state in which more illiberal regimes and coercive practices are ascendant. But of course, what exactly this is going to entail conceptually and operationally, and how it might overcome some of the associated challenges, is a bit more elusive. And so that's what we're trying to do here. And we actually start from the premise that there is nothing particularly new or even creative about what we're proposing. Really, a grand strategy of democratic solidarity is a new name for a very old idea. And so for most of the half century after World War II, the United States pursued a grand strategy of democratic solidarity, even though it didn't call it that, in the sense that America's closest friends were countries that shared its commitment to liberal governance as well as its interest in containing Soviet power during the Cold War. The United States frequently talked about the Cold War as a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy, including from the very outset in Harry Truman's famous speech to Congress in March 1947, where he outlined the Truman Doctrine and sought a program of emergency aid for Greece and Turkey. Now, of course, the United States had transactional partnerships with all sorts of authoritarian regimes during the Cold War, just as it presumably will in dealing with China and Russia today. But the heart of Cold War grand strategy involved binding the United States to other leading democracies to create a cohesive strategic community that could withstand Soviet pressure and it could build a cooperative, thriving, liberal world. And so pursuing democratic solidarity wasn't a distraction from traditional geopolitical goals like maintaining a favorable balance of power. It was a way of accomplishing those objectives, just as it is today. Now, the historical irony here is that after the Cold War, the strategic premium on democratic solidarity seemed to decrease because the democracies were so utterly dominant and because the world's remaining autocracies often seemed like they were destined for historical oblivion. It became relatively common, I think, to believe that globalization and liberalization and economic integration were going to tame and ultimately transform the world's remaining autocratic regimes. And of course, by the end of George W. Bush's presidency, it had become almost taboo to talk about a strategy rooted in liberal values, in part thanks to the fact that there were costly and inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had been fought partly, although perhaps not primarily, in the name of promoting democracy. But today, the strategic landscape has shifted pretty dramatically. And we think there are several reasons why a grand strategy rooted in democratic cooperation is once again essential. And the first of these is simply that the era of effortless democratic dominance is over. And so in 2018, the share of global GDP that was accounted for by established consolidated democracies fell below 50% for the first time in more than a century. And meanwhile, you have Russia that's trying to reassert its power across the former Soviet Union into the Middle East and North Africa as well. And you have a neo-totalitarian China that's contending not just for regional dominance in Asia, but for global influence as well. Authoritarian leadership around the world are trying to use new technologies to tilt the arc of history towards illiberalism. And so what ties all these threats together is this: the democratic community increasingly faces perils that its members cannot effectively confront on its own. Second, we make the argument that geopolitical conflict is increasingly breaking down along ideological lines, excuse me. So it's true that the US, China, and US, Russia contests are struggles over the balance of power. It's also true that Chinese and Russian leaders don't like the existing balance of power, in part because they view the principles of the liberal international order as a severe threat to their regimes, and they believe that they would be safer in a more illiberal world. And so in both cases, Beijing and Moscow are working to roll back the global influence of democratic norms and to weaken the democratic countries that are opposing their designs. And so the clash of liberalism and illiberalism is more central to global affairs than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War, and US strategy should reflect that reality. The third reason is that stress on democratic values is actually critical as a political tool in the United States. It's a critical tool of domestic mobilization for great power conflicts. When Harry Truman went before Congress in March 1947, he talked a lot about the values dimension of the unfolding Cold War, in part because advisors like Dean Acheson realized that just talking about the pure geopolitical abstractions wouldn't sell with the American public. Rallying Americans for long, dangerous rivalries with all of the expense and the sacrifice that they entail typically requires speaking to their ideological passions as well as their geopolitical or their economic interests. And I think that's likely to prove true today. Fourth, and this one is a little bit sensitive, but I think that democratic solidarity should be seen as a means of strategic reassurance in the post-Trump era. And so I think we should give the Trump administration some credit for reorienting American strategy towards geopolitical competition or great power rivalry or whatever you want to call it. But the fact is that there were a number of blatantly illiberal aspects of Trump's foreign policy, in addition to the president's infringement on democratic norms within the United States. And all this sowed some pretty deep concerns among US allies about the future of American leadership. Those concerns are in some cases below the surface, but they are very much there. And so a strategy focused on cooperation with democracies, if it is paired with efforts to fortify American democracy itself, can help mitigate that damage by showing that America can still provide principled leadership on behalf of a liberal world order. And then finally, I'll just say that the United States should think expansively about democratic solidarity today, because its existing alliances and institutions probably aren't adequate on their own to address today's challenges. All of America's military alliances are still organized either bilaterally or regionally, as in the case of NATO. Even the G7, which we sometimes talk about as a global forum for democratic cooperation vis-a-vis China, is basically a transatlantic organization plus Japan. It's rooted in sort of the trilateralism of the 1970s. But threats to democracy are emerging on a global scale. This doesn't necessarily mean that we should form one global institution, a global NATO or a global alliance of democracies to address these problems. But I think the reality is that the world's democracies are going to struggle to respond effectively to challenges that are increasingly trans-regional in nature unless they find new and more ambitious ways of bringing together their combined energies. And so that's the why of the piece, and I will turn it over to Charlie to talk about the what.
Thanks, Hal. And before I kick off, let me just start by thanking Abe for hosting. Really appreciate it. And an enormous thanks to Corey for being willing to pillory Hal and I for our arguments, which we'll get to shortly. But Hal promised that I would get a little bit more nitty gritty in terms of walking through what does what Hal just talked about mean in actual practice. And so as we began to play with this, we sketched out that a grand strategy of democratic solidarity should rest on 8 pillars, and then the policy begins to fold under that. And those 8 pillars are, for those of you at home taking notes, countering coercion with a stress on collective measures, enhancing technological cooperation, shaping international institutions like the UN and the WHO, combating corruption, enhancing collective defense, stress on the collective, meeting threats from within, taking the offensive, and negotiating from strength. Now, as Hal just said, we're happy to get into more detail on any of those, but taken together, it's a program that would shield the world's democracies from authoritarian pressure while enabling them to exert selective counter pressure on their own. That strategy is ambitious, it's expansive, and it's inherently multilateral. And because of that, it's also inherently challenging. Now, each of the pillars that I just raced through may confront practical obstacles to implementation. And of course, the specifics of each of those pillars is open to debate. How it is that you combat corruption best, how you address authoritarian political warfare will and should invite debate. Yet, from our perspective, this strategy is designed to alleviate the dilemmas surrounding collective action as best as possible by focusing that action around different but overlapping groupings and initiatives, rather than trying to create a single unwieldy alliance or organization. Moreover, we'd add that it's unclear whether the problems and the difficulties that you'd have that are associated with such a strategy are more challenging than one that downplayed democratic values and subsequently forfeited some of the political and geopolitical advantages associated with emphasized things. But that doesn't mean that the strategy that we've put forward or any strategy is immune to critique. I know we're going to get to critique both from Corey, from Abe, I hope, and from everyone who's listening. But Hal and I want to preempt your critiques. So we took them on ahead of time because a serious strategy means taking on what are some of the challenges to it. So in fact, let me lay out quickly some of the counter arguments to what we have advocated for. The first one that you will hear often is that a democratic coalition is unnecessarily exclusive. Not every state's a democracy. And of course, some states that have been most effective in resisting Russia and China are either autocracies, such as Vietnam, or backsliding democracies like Poland. And thus, the argument holds that democratic coalition will be narrow and ineffective. Now, that would probably be true if democratic solidarity precluded cooperating with illiberal regimes. And it's true that the United States will need a wide range of partners when it's dealing with Russia and China. Yet, democracies can forge productive, if somewhat mercenary, relationships with illiberal countries, even as they cultivate, at the heart of the strategy, as Hal talked about, geopolitical and ideological unity of the democratic community. So the fact that NATO was an alliance explicitly rooted in shared democratic values, for example, didn't prevent it from including necessary partners such as Portugal or Turkey at certain points during the Cold War. And similarly, the United States can pursue democratic solidarity while also cooperating with partners such as Singapore or Vietnam today. Calling for deeper bonds among democracies simply recognizes the fact that the closest relationships the United States is likely to have will and should be among governments that share political values as well as geopolitical interests. A second related challenge holds that America cannot combat illiberalism within its existing alliance structures without fracturing them. Now, there are historical examples of overzealous ideological strategies. Jimmy Carter comes to mind here, that unnecessarily alienate important partners at the worst time possible. And for that reason, no serious strategist advocates a blanket policy of shunning imperfect friends. And yet, Washington should look for opportunities to defend democratic values where they are threatened while balancing those objectives against the geopolitical importance of the country in question. The third objection is that this grand strategy will alienate democracies that don't want to choose. They don't want to join the anti-China or the anti-Russia grouping. Now, that's a fair point. Corey, I think, made a similar point just this morning in her Atlantic piece. And this is why Hal and I chose to emphasize the importance of function over form. For instance, too early of a summit of democracies could backfire if democratic states are economically dependent on China. Think of Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance. Yet the approach that we took to advocating for seeks to focus instead on a more flexible approach that prioritizes concrete cooperation over high-profile public signaling. And because this rejects a one-size-fits-all approach, it allows more reticent members to participate selectively at first and hopefully expand their involvement over time. A fourth critique is that emphasizing democratic values turns everything into an existential crisis. It turns already fraught rivalries into intense ideological struggles. That was the problem with the Truman Doctrine from this perspective, that it made every clash between the US and the Soviet Union a seemingly fundamental contrast between freedom and totalitarianism. But a grand strategy that's centered on democratic values can and should involve consideration of how best to approach negotiations with totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. The reality, too, is that the US-China and US-Russia contests are inescapably ideological in the sense that they involve not simply differing geopolitical interests, but different visions of what principles individual societies and the international order should be based upon. The United States gains no strategic benefit from trying to ignore fundamental aspects of great power rivalry. Finally, and particularly following the assault by Trump supporters on Congress in January 2021, some have argued that American democracy is so deficient that America cannot lead any democratic coalition. It should go without saying that deep injustices remain in American society, and in the post-Trump era, the US must strengthen its own domestic institutions, not simply as a means of diplomatic credibility, but as a means of democratic survival. And reforms, whether we're talking at the federal, state, or local level, that targets systemic racism, corruption, political dysfunction, tribalism, and deficient civic education, among other pathologies, are necessary at this point. And yet, this task should be seen as a complement to, rather than a substitute for, a foreign policy rooted in democratic values. After all, democratic perfection at home has never been a prerequisite for democratic leadership abroad. If we think of Truman, when he spoke to Congress in 1947, the US was still practicing state-sponsored segregation in large parts of the country. During the Cold War, in fact, an ideological struggle against the Soviet Union created the exact pressures for the United States to improve its own democracy and thereby decrease the perceived hypocrisy of its diplomacy. Now, emphasizing ideological competition abroad can actually catalyze constructive change at home. And it also begs asking, if the United States doesn't lead the world's democracies in confronting their common challenges, what other country will? Let me close by emphasizing that the strategic logic of democratic solidarity is strong, the needs are quite compelling, and the objections, at least from our perspective, are less powerful than they might initially seem. But it bears repeating that the fundamental prerequisite for such a strategy is that the United States has to show greater fidelity to democratic values in its statecraft and its politics than it has manifested in recent years. As Hal said, the Trump administration periodically talked of rallying the free world against an authoritarian challenge, and it did invest in initiatives such as the Quad that can contribute to this objective. By and large, though, its rhetoric rang hollow, both at home and abroad, given the president's illiberal inclinations. President Biden now has the opportunity to model responsible democratic leadership at home and abroad. When it comes to great power rivalry, he's emphasized that collective action is the key, arguing that, quote, we're stronger and more effective when we're flanked by nations that share our visions for the future of the world. We believe that's exactly the right sentiment. Whether Biden can translate it into a coherent grand strategy of democratic solidarity will be the of his presidency. Over to you, Abe and Corey.
Thanks so much, Hal and Charlie. For those of you watching, if you want to submit questions, you can do so over Twitter by tweeting at Asia Program or email asia@wilsoncenter.org. But first, we'll turn things over to our friend, Dr. Corey Shockey.
So thank you. I think this is a terrific article and a really important one. I want to talk about three things I like about it. Two substantive areas where I think you have averted your eyes from significant possibilities of failure, and a bunch of areas for further exploration. So first, the things I like. You know, both the realists and the liberals can be so much too precious about this argument about the international order, right? The realists act like they're the only people who think seriously about interests and outcomes, which isn't true. And liberals very often run the risk of so venerating the idea that they don't hold it accountable. And so the first thing I really like about Hal and Charlie's article is that they don't treat the international order as though it's a status thing. In fact, they outline the metric that should show us whether it's succeeding or failing. And I want to quote it from the article. Its measure of success should be progress in expanding democratic collaboration against concrete problems. They were speaking specifically of the D10 when they wrote that, but I think it's the right metric overall for the liberal international order. Namely, is it actually capable of solving problems we need to have solved? And by setting a metric that will allow us to gauge, are there ideas, is the order capable of sustainment? And second, does it merit sustainment? I think is a really important standard. The second thing is that they deal outright with the best objections to their argument. And so often in our debates about the nature and direction of international order, we only deal with the strongest parts of our argument, not trying to sword fight against what are the actual legitimate challenges to what we are outlining. And the third thing that I really like about this article is that they make the Marvel Comics origin story interesting, right? Like so often in debates about the liberal order, we look back to a mythological age where statesmen stood astride the world like colossus, and the United States wasn't tawdry and political and narrow-minded, and allies actually did what we needed of them. And one of the things that comes through so nicely in the first 40% of the article that talks about where did this come from and why is it important, is reminding us that math class wasn't newly hard. Math class has always been hard. And we need to think in a tough-minded way about how do we preserve what needs preserving and how do we advance it if it suits our purposes. I would parenthetically say that Hal rightly pointed out in his introduction that this is an old idea, but if our mutual friend John Eikenberry were here, he would point out it's a lot older idea than Harry Truman. And he would at least go back to the British of the 18th century. And if our AEI colleague Giselle Donnelly were here, she would trace its roots back even further. I'll settle for just saying you could at least mark it by Woodrow Wilson. And there's a reason, and the reason is exactly what Hal and Charlie point out that is so often overlooked, in particular by people who do not support this notion that the international order is liberal by design and that that's the best avenue for preserving and advancing American interests. What is so often overlooked by those people is that ideology, the belief that people have values and they loan them in limited ways to governments for consensual purposes, that is the natural order of things, is necessary to get Americans to care about the rest of the world. So all of these other sophisticated ideas that say that ideology doesn't matter, doesn't deliver the United States of America to solve the problem. So two challenges that I think have the potential for the failure of Charlie and Hal's idea that they didn't address. And the first is that they didn't mention the West's self-congratulatory hypocrisy, the times where we pretend we are doing this, but are not. And the reason I think it's significant is because it looks to me like a lot of the way our authoritarian challengers are picking up ground in opposition to this idea is by playing the gap between what we say we are going to do and our actual risk tolerance. The most egregious example might be President Obama on Syria, drawing a red line that we wouldn't honor, but there are a dozen examples from the Trump administration as well. And to be uncharitable to an administration that is 2 months in office, I fear that the Biden administration is talking a very good game on human rights that we are not going to actually be willing to take risks and make sacrifices in order to advance in the world. So that's the first challenge, the gap between what we say we are going to do and what we are actually willing to do. And I fear that because it looks to me like the Chinese and the Russians are really good at delegitimizing the liberal international order by playing into those gaps with their own interventions. The second challenge I would raise is that especially when they are talking about the first pillar of democratic solidarity, countering coercion, but it carries through the other 7 of them as well, which is the strongest need to go first in taking action on this. And we actually aren't, right? So it is conventional wisdom that it would be impossible for the Biden administration to join the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. It would unquestionably be hard, but if you look at the polling of American public attitudes about trade agreements, they're much more positive than that would suggest. We are treating democratic difficulties as fixed constraints on ourselves and the other strongest powers in the international order. But we're expecting countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, or smaller middleweight countries that run much greater risks than we do of countering China, to make big, brave choices before we do. In support of Hal and Charlie's argument, this is why I think the Quad is so important. By those 4 countries banding together and starting to do hard things together, they are setting an example that shows countries like South Korea already wanting to opt in, because we are, of course, as is the fundamental argument of Hal and Charlie's piece, we are safer together, and finding ways to array ourselves together is the success of it. So those are the 2 big challenges. Let me just, in closing, frost the cake a little with areas I would love to see you guys push out further, because I think you've done a better job than the rest of us have in making the argument in practical terms why this is in our interest. In support of your pillar, I think you should push the argument forward more about things that the liberal states need to stop doing. The US needs to stop putting secondary sanctions on our allies and the countries we want to align. We need to think more seriously about sanctions and their long-term risk to dollar dominance, as well as to alliances, since even our European friends are now looking for a vehicle to get around dollar dominance. And of course, it's not just a Trump administration problem. I think back to the Bush administration when we were going to refuse to cooperate militarily with countries that were ICC signatories. And it'll require restraining Congress to cut back on sanctions. On technology, something you guys didn't mention that I think you should have is innovating past current restrictions, right? Take Ralph Waldo Emerson's argument that in skating over thin ice, our safety lies in our speed. For the Western countries, our safety lies in innovation, moving past the moment. But I think working together on tech is a lot harder than you guys give it credit for. Yes, we would have a huge database, and yet we cannot agree with our European friends on common data restrictions of use. Maybe a white CFIUS process would get you past that, agreeing which companies we can trust together. Maybe the cyber alert system of sharing when somebody's under attack and what it means might be a model. I'd love to see you guys think more about that. I agree that transparency is our best tool. How do we get Wall Street and Silicon Valley to sign on to the approach you guys want? Do they actually have to write off the China market? And if so, what does it look like to get that? What else? The last point I'll make is that, to quote you guys, multilateral support against threats from within, end quote. I think that's a lot trickier than you're allowing. And I would set as the test case for you guys, what should we have done as Turkey slid? Because, nope, I'm sorry, one last point. I agree on the cost imposing strategy. I think that's exactly the right approach to the problem of authoritarian challengers. But I'd love to see you expand on how do we engage our own publics, right? How do we get Westerners to buy more H&M clothes, given what China has done? How do we think about cost imposing strategies that engage our public?
That's great. Thank you so much, Corey. Terrific presentations all. I had a number of questions lined up. Corey hit about all of them. I've got a few more though, thankfully, that I can lean on. For those of you watching, we already have a few questions coming in from our audience. You can tweet them at Asia Program. You can email them, asia@wilsoncenter.org. I have a few questions, but Hal, Charlie, I wonder if you had any reactions or responses to Corey's comments before we jump into that.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, these are wonderful comments, Corey, and really appreciate you taking the time to read the piece and to offer your insights. I'll just say three things really quick in response to the two areas where we averted our eyes from the possibility of failure, and then one on the historical point about where this comes from. And this might actually be an interesting subject for greater discussion. The reason that we chose 1947 as opposed to 1917 or the 19th century is that we were looking at it from the perspective of when does the United States adopt on a sustained basis a grand strategy that puts democratic solidarity at the forefront. And you'd obviously seen the intellectual forerunners for that with Wilson and a variety of other folks. But it would be interesting to bring Giselle and others into the conversation or look at some of the history that you surveyed in your book on Anglo-American relations and think about whether that's an unfair standard for thinking about early 20th century or 19th century foreign policy. Just to expand a little bit on the two areas that you flagged of potential failure, I would say I think this is exactly right. I would phrase it a little bit differently in the sense that what I worry about is that we will go whole hog on ideological competition because that is rhetorically easy to do, but not go whole hog on all of sort of the hard power foundation strengthening stuff that you need to have in reserve in case things get really hot, right? And so just to put this bluntly, I think it's great that we are going to, speak candidly about Chinese and Russian human rights violations and try to get after them in a multilateral context. It's also possible we could find ourselves in a position of facing a choice of whether or not to fight a war over Taiwan within the next 4 years. And so one of the challenges actually the United States runs into during the early Cold War is that we get about 2.5, 3 years into the Cold War and realize that we have dramatically shortchanged the hard power part of the equation. And it's the Korean War actually that makes that clear. And fortunately, we're able to recover from it. But I think that's a similar area where you could run into a gap of the sort that you talk about today. And I would also say, I think I fundamentally agree with the point about countering coercion. I sometimes think that we think that TPP is more politically toxic than it actually is. And the issue isn't just that the polls say that trade is great. And actually, even in 2017, right after Trump killed TPP, the polls said TPP is great as well. The reason that TPP ran aground politically, I think, was in part due to sort of a failure of political will and a failure of political timing, frankly, by the Obama administration, which waited so long to push for TPA and then TPP that the issue got wound up in the 2016 campaign in a way that it didn't necessarily need to. And so I do worry that we sometimes sort of psych ourselves out a little bit on the politics of trade here. The other piece of it that you raised, which I think is exactly right, is Are we actually willing to, we talk a lot about saying, Australia, you're not on your own when you're dealing with Chinese economic coercion, but are we actually willing to share some of the pain with countries that are being coerced economically by China? Or are we just happy to see American wine producers pick up some of the market share that's being vacated by Australian wine producers that are now no longer able to export to China? I think that in some ways that'll be the acid test of this idea of solidarity against economic coercion. And I think that, we have sort of the idea there, but what that actually looks like in terms of pain sharing mechanisms has yet to be developed.
I'm going to hop on that with a couple of comments, if I may, for those really good charges that you've given us, Corey. So one is just to amplify what you said. When we were living in Australia, particularly as the US started its trade war with China, one of the kind of quieter conversations that you would hear emanating from officialdom was, look, we all know that more or less we have the same set of complaints about the way that China goes about its political economy, but it manifests quite differently. So here's the deal. We're going to take it on the chin, we being the US, but don't you go, Australia or India, and move into soybean sales when we're taking it on the chin, because we're doing this for the team. So it's funny when you reverse that equation, as Hal just did and as Corey did. The question is, and I heard this all the time when I was out there, which is, great, we're along for the ride with you guys, comma, perhaps, but what exactly is it that you're trying to accomplish? Is it to increase your market share, or are you guys going to accept more pain and more risk yourself? So, Corey, when I was listening to your comments, I actually, your two distinct charges struck me as both revolving around the same question as, what is our risk tolerance? And is it only in the rhetorical category, or are we willing to demonstrate some increased risk and some increased willingness to do things ourselves first? So let me just add two things in here. So the first is, yes, we want our friends who are on the front lines to spend more on their defense because they need to. But the question is, how is that more likely to occur? From poking them, from saying pretty please, or from us doing more ourselves? And if someone had the answer for that, we could stop the debate about free riders overall. I tend to think, I think Hal tends to think too, because we've had this conversation before, that you're more likely to get solvency for that argument if you are paying into it yourself. And so one area where I see, putting aside the TPP debate, is thus far, when we're talking about, consistently you would hear during the Trump administration, that's great that you're willing to line up rhetorically, but where's your money behind this? Put your money where your mouth is. And what I'm watching really closely here is, because everyone and their mother says that this is no longer just a defense competition, what actually is going to happen with this endless frontiers bill and in other related areas? $110 billion, if that's what it amounts to, apart from the defense competition, is not chump change. But again, are we going to do this? And are we going to do this in ways that only advantage the United States is one. The second thing that I would say, which we highlighted a little bit, I think it's the seventh pillar, if I remember correctly, is part of risk means calibrated risk going on the offensive. And so that's true in a lot of different domains, but one that I would highlight, one of the easiest areas to play with, but oftentimes we have not wanted to do it, is how willing are we to call out and to make real efforts in the anti-corruption space? We go back to the Panama paper. There is a ton of stuff that the United States could do, relatively low cost on the surface, but the blowback is likely to come quickly. And so I am all for the idea of taking more risk, but and as Corey has said, what that means in different categories of action looks quite different. And it doesn't, as Hal said, just mean rhetorically.
Well, thanks to you both. We have about 15 minutes left. The first question, this is one of the questions that I had prepared that Corey did not touch on, and also is similar to a question that came in from Octavian Mania from the Eastern Focus Quarterly, and it's asking about Taiwan. What would be the implications of a grand strategy of democratic solidarity in the case of Taiwan? Specifically, should the United States end strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan? What would be the implications of the United States including or not including Taiwan in its approach to democracies and as a perimeter for American national security in the Indo-Pacific? I don't know who would want to jump on that first. Hal, you unmuted yourself. I assume that means you want to.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of quick remarks, and maybe Charlie can tell me what I got wrong. So I think the ending strategic ambiguity is not necessarily a bad idea, but only if it's done in coordination with things that actually make it harder for China to conquer Taiwan. And so if you try to substitute a change in declaratory policy for a change in the capabilities needed to substantiate that policy, I worry that you actually risk creating an incentive for China to go sooner rather than later vis-a-vis Taiwan in anticipation of further steps to come. And so I would like to have the debate about strategic ambiguity in the context of a larger debate about what will it actually take to defend Taiwan and what are we willing to put into it. But I would also say that when we're thinking about Taiwan in the context of what Charlie and I have argued about, it's not just a matter of military defense. Part of it would be a matter of, frankly, trying to stop and then reverse the progressive marginalization of Taiwan from the international community, which is something that the PRC has done very effectively over the past few decades. And if you think about the various areas in which the US-China competition is playing out, economic dimension, technological dimension, the military balance in the Western Pacific, the clash between democratic norms and authoritarian regimes, Taiwan is actually pretty well placed to play an important role in all of those areas. And so I would like to see efforts to amplify rather than to wind down Taiwan's role in international organizations, in broader cooperative efforts to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific and so on and so forth. And I think that's just as important as sort of the military and defense side of the question.
So I would just hop on to say, from the military angle, all you have to do is read Hal's terrific foreign affairs piece with Michael Beckley that he wrote precisely on this question, which we allude to and even footnote. It's always fun to footnote yourself, or at least one of yourselves. But the two other things that I would say here is, forget about the United States for a second here. Taiwan has done such a great service for itself by showing its leadership in multiple spaces over the past year. And I think that we look no further than the leading role that Taiwan has played in global health. If Taiwan had been in this earlier, if it had not been marginalized by the WHO, we would all be so much healthier and safer at this point. So Hal highlighted the institutional dimension. We all know that Taiwan has had its institutional role rolled back progressively over the last several years. And this is a key space that it makes eminent sense. I think it would be hard to find a serious argument that Taiwan deserves less of a space in the conversation about global health at this time. The two other things I would just flag recently is just yesterday or today, you saw some good rhetoric coming out of the US-Japan dialogue in advance of the leaders meeting about what they might do together on Taiwan. And I would just leave this because the question, I think, Abe, the third part of the question you said is, and what does this mean potentially as Taiwan as part of the US defense perimeter? And I would say it's not potentially, it is part of the defensive perimeter if you simply look at the geography of Asia at this point.
Great, thanks to you both. Next question is similar to along the lines of something that Corey was asking, but something that struck me when talking about democratic solidarity is that when you dig into a lot of the issue areas that you talk about, there's a question to you about who's responsible for the solidarity piece? Is it the Americans or is it the other democracies? And I can think of a lot of different issues. For example, with sanctions and India, is it the responsibility of the United States to not sanction India on CAATSA, or is it the responsibility of the Indians to not get missile defense systems that would trigger those sanctions? Similarly, on technology, there are actually significant differences between the United States and several other democratic countries on issues like data localization, privacy, pieces like that. So, to your mind, where does the responsibility for solidarity come from when we have not just differences of interests, but differences of policies on these issues? And how do you propose in a strategy of democratic solidarity for the United States to navigate these complexities between democracies and issues that have pretty significant implications for our ability to compete with countries like China and Russia?
Sure, I'll go first on this. So look, I'm going to offer a very broad stroke and therefore inherently unsatisfying answer, because this necessarily is a question that has to be adjudicated on the issues. What issue is it exactly that you're talking about? Abe, you raised at least two rather thorny ones here. Where is the place that it's likely to be adjudicated? My basic answer is that in coordination between us, between democratic allies up front. That is, we're always better for coordinating with each other. If we end up lockstep, terrific. If we don't, we know that before we proceed to the second part of the argument vis-a-vis authoritarian competitors. And I just say that, again, I don't want to harp too much on my Australian experience, but the US and Australia are incredible allies, but we hardly see everything the same way. And yet being very clear with them about where we are lined up and where we are not, and choosing which ones we are willing to prioritize, which ones we're willing to speak the same way, which way we're going to take separate efforts, and which way we're just going to stay and have the same rate important.
So I'm actually interested to get Abe's and Corey's views on this, because I know you guys have thought about this a lot as well. I mean, I'll just say with respect to the India S-400 thing is interesting, because I think it brings up a broader point regarding when should you coerce your allies, right? And so we talk a lot about deepening cooperation with allies. Of course, we've always used pressure and coercion to get what we want out of our allies as well, or to try to get what we want out of our allies as well. And there's sort of an art to doing it. I think the question that the S-400 sale to India raises is, should we hold in reserve sanctions and other forms of pressures for steps that allies or partners are taking that we worry will significantly undermine our collective ability to meet the foremost challenge? And so maybe, Huawei in your 5G system is something that meets that threshold. But is it different when we're dealing with something that is annoying and, potentially damaging, but doesn't actually undermine your collective ability to meet the greatest challenge? It's hard to argue that India acquiring S-400s really does a whole lot of damage to the American national interest. Yes, I know it's problematic if it comes with Russian technicians and all of that stuff, but hey, it strengthens India's ability to resist Chinese coercion, and it puts Russian systems at the forefront of doing that, which is a little bit awesome when you think about the way that might conceivably, lead to greater frictions between Russia and China. And so this is a case, not knowing a whole lot about the Indian example, where I would be more inclined to say this one isn't that damaging. They should probably get a waiver on it, although we got to act like we hem and haw a lot so that we don't give everybody an incentive to do this. And so I think the broader issue is that there have always been disputes in U.S. relations with democratic friends and allies, and the critical part of managing that has always been an ability on both sides to differentiate between lesser and greater evils, right? And to understand when the evil of living with a European ally's frustrating position on the European defense community or whatever it might be is less significant than the evil that comes with blowing up the relationship. And so it's that sense of proportion, I think, that kind of got lost during the Trump years when we would regularly coerce our allies over silly stuff. And I think that's what we're trying to regain today.
So I am doctrinally opposed to coercive measures against allies. I actually think both the most useful and the most appropriate way to penalize your allies is with the lack of your attention and participation. That is with absent space, not with flat coercive measures. So with Turkey and the S-400, I think the right answer is we can't continue to do allied air defense with Turkey. So we have to stop doing that. And with India, I don't think we're going to want to do major exercises in the Indian Ocean where they're using Russian S-400 systems to track American or Japanese or Australian aircraft. And I'm a little more skeptical than you sound, Hal, that that India having Russian systems is necessarily a bad thing for China, because the alternative would be Russia and China sharing the data that they take from Indian systems.
Thanks to all of you. We have 4 minutes left, and so I have the final lightning round question. And it can be for all three of you. Corey, you're certainly free to pass if you prefer. But because we just have a short amount of time, and this has been a fairly a very rich discussion, but I'm wondering if we could get down to brass tacks on some practical policies that we can do at the Wilson Center. Our mandate is to bring the world of academia to practical policy debates. And I feel like we're really hitting that out of the park this afternoon. But last question, if you were all able to sit down with Jake Sullivan and you had a couple of minutes to pitch this idea from your article, what would you say are some of the practical things that the United States could do now to put us on the track towards implementing a strategy of democratic solidarity? We've already had a Quad summit, the first of its kind. We've had a lot of engagement with NATO, with the Europeans. What are some practical things that you would pitch that the United States could do now to get us on this path?
Yeah, I'll just mention a couple. And so one is beef up the interparliamentary stuff. And so I think actually what European governments are in some ways less hawkish vis-a-vis China than some of their parliamentary backbenchers are, and then in some cases public opinion is. And so I think that's actually a very useful and perhaps underutilized mechanism for thinking about how to move Europe in the right direction on Chinese economic and technological issues in the future. The other thing, I think Charlie and I are a little bit more bearish on the idea of a summit of democracies than the Biden administration is, and because I worry a little bit more about the risks. What happens if that doesn't come off smoothly, and does it have a deflating effect on the entire agenda? I think the counter argument to that is that it's a useful way of mobilizing government to deal with these issues. And so that's one where I'll be very interested to see how it plays out over the coming months.
Yeah, on the second one, I'd just pick up a little bit from Hal, which is, as we all know, those of us who observe these things, President Biden in the campaign called for a democracy summit in his first year. They've now reiterated on that. It doesn't matter whatever Hal and I said in this argument, they're going to have one. So the question is, how can that be most fruitfully used, given that there are a lot of other questions? Who gets invited? What about those backsliding members? And I would just say, if I were to give some advice here, is that use it from, particularly with our core allies as best as possible. And the pitch that I would use, that I have used when I've been overseas, is if you want to have a hand in shaping US policy in your region, with your own country, and at the larger level, you better come to the table not just willing to listen to what the United States is doling out, but with a series of initiatives and some resources that you're putting on the table. My guess is a lot of that legwork is already being done. But as we know, things on the calendar are more likely to drive agenda setting and policy making than almost anything else out there. So I would say really make use of this opportunity in terms of, yes, driving some outcomes, having a nice set of deliverables, but making sure that people are really sharpening their pencils right now from a variety of capitals on what it is that they want to see done in their region and what they're going to actually lead on.
Well, thank you to all three of you. We're at the end of the event. Thank you to all three for joining us today. I think the discussion's been very rich and very nuanced. And thank you all for tuning in. Before we sign off, I'd like to thank Trayon Burgess, Tracy Fitzgerald for putting this together, as well as Lucas Myers for handling the Q&A on Twitter and email. And finally, thank you to Charlie Adele, Hal Brands, and Corey Shockey for coming. This has been terrific. Thank you so much, and have a good day.